What's up with all these versions of the Bible? What's going on? I'm Gavin, and this is Rooted Faith Network. In this video, we're going to be looking at what's going on with all these versions of the Bible. Are they wrong? Are they different? Are there many mistakes over hundreds or thousands of years? Because those are the excuses and the arguments I've heard more than I care to remember. But for a careful student of literature, of the historicity of literature, of the authenticity and authority of the Bible, those are ridiculous questions, because when people ask those questions, it tells me they don't know the facts. Because no one who has done any research or had a look into the science of translation, textual criticism, or other branches of study related to ancient scriptures, if they knew anything about that, they wouldn't say such ridiculous things. But for the man in the street, for the armchair expert, the uninformed fool, they seem to be very plausible, and they get thrown at me often. But here's the thing. The Bible is reliable, it's accurate, it's trustworthy, and it's been beautifully preserved by God through the wise decisions of people, so that the Bible we have in our hand today, whether it's in a hard copy form or digital form, we can trust that as reliable and authoritative. Now, of course, different translations have different strengths and weaknesses. Different translation committees have different objectives, and if one is to read the preface of the Bible that you have, you'll understand what their objective was, where they're going, and why they chose various words, English words in my case, for the Greek of the New Testament or the Hebrew of the Old Testament. So let's clear up something straight away. The two main groups of Bibles are translations and paraphrase. Now, a paraphrase, you hear the word para there, it's got something to do with parallel. Well, it is. It's alongside. It's one form of English alongside another. So a paraphrase is a Bible where it's been changed into what was traditional language, in the case of the King James, the these and the thous and the thines and the whensts, into English that is more suitable for today's audience. And so that happens all the time. But it's English, one form of English, to perhaps a more accessible form of English, and in some cases a form of English that can be understood by someone who is not a natural English speaker. It's not their mother tongue, it's not their birth language. So, for example, the Good News is a paraphrase that is used for people who are not English speakers by birth. And so it eliminates a lot of language and makes it more acceptable, more understandable for whom English is not their first language. And that happens all the time. On the other side are translations. Now, obviously, Transvaal in the old days, it was across the Vaal River. Transatlantic, it's across the Atlantic. So it's moving from one place to another. And in the case of biblical translations, it's moving from the original language, in the Old Testament Hebrew, in the New Testament Greek, into a receptor language. In my case, as an English speaker, it's into English. So paraphrase one form of English to another form of English that's perhaps easier to understand for those who aren't English speakers by birth. And a translation is moving from the original languages, Greek for the New Testament, Hebrew for the Old Testament, into a receiver language, in my case, English. So that's the main distinction. Now, on that continuum, so if you can imagine a line across the middle of your screen, now I'm talking about translations, and then I'll talk about the paraphrase. In the case of a translation, you have what on this side would be a very literal translation from the Greek and the Hebrew to the English. For example, the King James Bible or the Revised Standard Version. They are aiming to be very literal, and by that I mean very accurate and close to the way the language was spoken in the original of the Bible, Hebrew Old Testament, Greek New Testament. On the other side of the continuum, you have the dynamic translations. So those are translations that have been taken from the original biblical languages into English And they are trying to find a good balance. So we're moving across a continuum, if you can see, back to the literal, all the way to like hyperdynamic, if you like. They're trying to find a balance on that translation seesaw where it's going to be reliable and true to the original language, but also accessible and workable and usable for today's reader, for today's student of the Bible, for the Christian. One needs to look at, again, the preface of the Bible and see what was the purpose of the translation committee. Now, it's important to recognize committees of scholars who are involved in translation for Bibles. And that committee of scholars will come from a whole range of theological disciplines. You'll have historians, archaeologists, linguists, experts in culture, and they will work together as they translate from the original biblical languages into English. So it's not the opinion of one person. It's thorough, diligent, deliberate study, and it takes many meetings and usually many years for a new translation to be published. Obviously, with a paraphrase, it's an in-depth work, but it doesn't take as long and it's not as difficult because one is dealing with English to English, a more formal version of English to a more accessible idiomatic form of English. Again, from the King James Version to the Living Translation, not a translation, it's a paraphrase, was done by Kenneth Taylor, who found when he was doing Bible time with his children, which is what every father should be doing with their children, they were battling, obviously, to understand the old King James English. That English was spoken over 400 years ago. And so he decided to make it easier for his children to understand the Bible, so he did a paraphrase from the King James into what became known as the Living Translation. He did it for his kids, but it became very popular to the point where the Living Translation is now available all over the world. Paraphrase. I'm getting myself confused. So the Living Bible, Living Translation, is a paraphrase, but very popular. Today we also have the New Living Bible, and it's updated the English and actually been done by a group, a committee of scholars, not just one man. And it's always better when it's done by a committee because we have to try and reduce the bias, theological bias, cultural bias, preferential bias, and a committee of people from different walks of life and from different disciplines kind of brings more balance to that. The Message by Eugene Peterson originally was a one-man paraphrase where he really went for, and for the most part I think did a very good job, of going to a very earthy, acceptable, if you like, raw expression of the Bible. And it certainly is raw. It's fresh, it's kind of provocative in a good way. And I think the Psalms in the Message are really good. Not accurate necessarily in terms of contextual translation, exegetical translation, but very good in terms of making it very accessible to the average reader. The way to avoid falling to the trap of the bias or the preference of a given translation or paraphrase is to read a whole bunch of different versions. So let's just throw them out there. Revised Standard Version, Living Bible, New Living Bible, King James, the Message, the Good News, the English Standard Version, which in terms of translation is more literal. So it's I'm not saying this in a negative way. It's more wooden. It's not as flexible. It's perhaps not as user friendly, but there's no problem with it. There's no major faults with the ESV. The problem is when people become guilty of what is called translation loyalty. So then we start to argue about which translation, which paraphrase is better. And you get those who still are in the King James, the authorized version. That's the Bible that Paul wrote or read, No, it was translated 400 years ago and authorized, not by God, but by King James in England. Everything that was published had to be approved and authorized by the king because he wanted his cut, he wanted recognition, he wanted to be in charge. So it was authorized by a godless earthly king. And that's why it's called sometimes the authorized version. Got nothing to do with God authorizing it whatsoever. Some people defend that to the death. Others will go for the ESV or the Revised Standard Version. Some people get very hot under the collar that that's the most accurate. The reality is, it's a ya-near answer. It's great being a South African and dealing with theology and biblical truth, because often the correct answer is ya-near. It's yes because it does very well in certain parts of the Bible, maybe part of the Old Testament, part of the New Testament. Maybe it's better at bringing out some accuracy in terms of what was very close to the events of the day, the context of the day, the lifestyle of the day. But in other parts it'll be weak. It depends who's on the translation committee. So again, that's why don't get bogged down with one version of the Bible. I've often been guilty of being very biased towards the NIV and particularly the 1984 version. I think after that, the NIV went a bit pear-shaped, tried to go gender neutral, but there's no such thing as neutral, and it went too far. Plus the fact that the rights to that Bible were bought out by a secular company, so their commitment to accuracy, theological and biblical accuracy, is not even, doesn't exist. But I like the 1984 NIV, but I use others. I use the ESV, I still use King James. But I'm blessed that I was able to study theology and do biblical languages, so I have a working knowledge of Greek and Hebrew. So I can go back and look at what the original message was, what the text said, the words that were used, the syntax, the context of things, the meanings of various words, how various words were used, why they were used in that place. So I'm blessed to have those skills, but that doesn't stop anyone from reading up on translations, the science of translation, reading more on biblical archaeology, history, the economy of the ancient Near East, in the case of the Old Testament, and Second Temple Judaism, and all that we're learning and scholars are revealing to us through their research on Second Temple Judaism. So that would have been the temple that was built by Herod and was destroyed in 70 AD. And a lot of research has been done up until recently, relatively decades ago. Not a lot of work was done and not a lot of work was made accessible on Second Temple Judaism. So we're getting closer and closer to the Jesus of the first century, to the context of the first century, and understanding more context. We got more color, we got more texture, we got more relief in terms of, if you think of biblical topography, what's high, what's low, what's leaning this way, what's leaning that way, where are the hills, where are the valleys. A lot of research is being done, which is shedding more and more light. And it's not changing the message we have. The Bible has not been corrupted. Contrary to popular belief and what Muslims claim all the time, the Bible's been corrupted. Well, that's just a smokescreen, a cover-up for the fact that their Quran is so unreliable and so late and so inaccurate and so full of holes. That's not easy to show. But we can do that in another video, perhaps. But in terms of biblical scholarship, we are not changing the translation. Nothing's been corrupted. We're just getting closer and closer to the date and the time period in question so that we understand more dynamically, more meaningfully, what was actually going on in that given time in history. So don't shy away from studying, from researching, from investigating. It all becomes extremely enriching. Further to the point that we can trust our Bible is that we have over 24,000 manuscripts and pieces or fragments of manuscripts for the New Testament alone. And none of them are disagreeing with each other. Out of that 24,000 plus, we have some 5,000 plus Greek manuscripts. And they're not contradicting each other. There's no major differences. There might be a scribal tweak here or there, but nothing that changes the fundamental meaning of what the Bible that we hold in our hands and study and read and learn from today. Somebody said that the Bible is over 98% accurate. Now that's why is it not 100%? Well, nothing's 100% in terms of copies of manuscripts, but that's way ahead of any other ancient literature. We can't say for certain that the Iliad was written by Homer. That's what tradition tells us. That's what very scrappy evidence tells us, but nobody argues that the author of that great poem is Homer. Nobody questions that. nobody questions the history of the Gallic Wars written by Caesar. I think it was Julius Caesar, his journal of his wars and his conquests. Nobody questions that, but we don't have enough copies. There's just not enough copies, and those copies are not close enough to the time period which they record the events of a given time. They're hundreds of years later. Now, all the documents for the New Testament, if you really want to stretch it, goes into the late 1st century. That's it. So 60 years plus after the events of Jesus' life. But it's way closer than that. It's within years, within months, and in some cases within weeks of the life, the ministry, the betrayal, the torture, the crucifixion, the burial, the resurrection, and the ascension. From a historical point of view, the Bible is beyond doubt. So much so that Dr. Simon Greenleaf, one of the authorities in the legal profession, the legal field, says that the evidence for the Bible, and particularly the evidence for the resurrection of the Lord Jesus Christ, will stand up to scrutiny in any court of law anywhere in the world. So we can trust the Bible that we have today. Are there better ones? Yes. Are there more accessible ones? Yes. Are there more accurate ones? Yes. But there's no such thing as a really bad version of the Bible, and there's no version or translation or paraphrase that is so far from the original that it's not worth looking at. The evidence is overwhelming, the jury is out, the verdict is in, and the Bible has stood the test of time. Over 100 years of liberal scholarship have criticized and critiqued and tried to undermine and discredit the Bible, and the Bible has come through with absolute flying colors. So be encouraged. The Bible you're reading is reliable, it's accurate, it's authentic, it's historical. It's not a history book, it's not a science book. It doesn't give us all the answers. It's not complete in the way that it records the events of Jesus' life. John said himself, if we were to record all that Jesus said and did during his 3 years of earthly ministry, the sky would not be enough parchment or paper, and the seas would not be enough ink. But what we have is reliable, and it tells us what we need to know about who is God, who are we, why are we here, and where are we going, and why do we suffer while we're here. It deals with all the major questions of life and comes through excellently. So be encouraged, study the Bible, research, dig, look around, ask questions, investigate. We encourage believers to study, to evaluate the Bible, and be diligent with that. No cult, no man-made religion in the world will encourage the critique of their own documents. You won't find that in a cult. Muslims are discouraged. They're told it's point blank, verbatim, what they need. It's perfectly preserved. There's not one mistake, but Muslim scholars now are admitting they're lying about that because eventually the truth comes out. So in no cult, the Mormons won't allow you to critique the Book of Mormon. The JWs, the Jehovah's Witnesses, won't allow you to critique the New World Translation. You have to accept it by blind faith. But we say to Christians, go ahead, dig, investigate, evaluate, interrogate. Because if you're honest with yourself and you do your homework, you're not going to come up with a different conclusion than many scholars across the world from different cultures and backgrounds, biblical scholars. You're not going to come to a different conclusion. It'll just reinforce the truth that we know. So we don't stop you from investigating and critically evaluating. We encourage that. And that by itself is one of the greatest distinguishing characteristics of true biblical faith. We're not threatened. We're not insecure. We are eager to learn and to grow, and so we dig and we dig and we dig. Enjoy the journey. If you have any questions or comments, please send them to us. If you like the video, please give us a like, subscribe, share this information with people who might have a similar question, and give us more suggestions for different topics. We'd love to scratch where it itches and deal with whatever's on your heart and mind.